U.S. Civil War Battles Lecture Take 4. Hi everyone, it's Mr. Macaluso, and I'm struggling mightily today to produce this video. I wanted to use PowerPoint today, and it's taking me a lot of time, so I apologize and how late this video got up. Anyway, hopefully it'll work this time. So today I want to talk about some important battles that have large political significance during the Civil War. Every battle has political significance, but think of it this way. During the Civil War, Lincoln, not only does he have to keep the public happy by showing progress in the war, but that war is being fought on American soil against Americans. No other US president has ever had to deal with that. So it's not an easy task for Abraham Lincoln. Fortunately, he works his magic. So I want to use PowerPoint, and I'm going to bring the PowerPoint up right now, and we're going to look at that. I want you to let me know whether or not the PowerPoint is useful. As I said, it takes kind of a long time for me to produce it, and so I'm just not sure it's something I should use. Anyway, here's the PowerPoint, and yeah, let's see how that works. Let me bring up my picture. You got to see my picture, right? Okay, so before we talk about the battles, I do want to talk about two other important things. The first thing I want to talk about are the border states. Now, in our last lecture, I mentioned that the border states were critical. If Lincoln couldn't keep the border states on his side, then the war would be lost, okay? And we saw how Lincoln kind of masterfully dealt with his dilemma at Fort Sumter and kept the border states happy, or at least happy enough to not leave the Union. And that was really important. So I want to talk about the border states. I also want to talk about Lincoln expanding executive power. Just like Andrew Jackson did, Lincoln is also going to expand executive power. And I think he's going to do it in ways that have real kind of significance and relevance to today's world. Okay, so hopefully we can get to all that. Please take notes. And if there's something that really confuses you, we can talk about it in our meeting on Wednesday. All right, so here we go. Let's talk about the border states. So there's a lot of obvious reasons why the border states are important, but first, some not so obvious reasons. The reading that I've assigned, or that I will have assigned by the time you see this, points some of these reasons out. First thing I want to say is this. You should know by now that the North definitely has a larger population than the South. And in this long war of attrition, I'll explain what that means later, having a big population is going to be really important. Well, it turns out that if the border states leave the Union and join the South, that would increase the South's population by about 50%. That's big, right? That's just that many more people who could keep your war effort going. Additionally, if the border states left, that would increase the South's manufacturing by 100%. Again, you know that most of the manufacturing in the country is up in the North, up in New England. However, the border states have manufacturing, and they would double the manufacturing of the South if they left. That, again, would be huge for the South. The third thing is something that you and I don't really think about, but if the border states leave, that increases the number of horses and mules in the South by 50%. Now, railroads are going to be hugely important in this war, and that's going to give the advantage to the North. But it's still a war that is, makes heavy use out of horses and mules. And when I say horses, I don't mean just for cavalry charges. I also mean for just basic transportation. Sadly, the Kentucky Derby, I believe, has been canceled for this year. The Kentucky Derby would be soon, if not this weekend. It would be pretty soon. Why do we all know about the Kentucky Derby? Why is it such a famous horse race? Well, I'll tell you why. The Kentucky Derby is so famous, yes, more famous than the Preakness, Marylanders. You should know that. The Kentucky Derby is so famous because Kentucky was considered the largest slave breeding state in the Union during the Civil War. right? Kentucky was known for its horse production. And if Kentucky goes to the South, that means the South is going to get the cream of the crop. So that's huge. Okay. Here are there's another kind of obvious reason why the border states are important. If Maryland leaves, what does that do to Washington, D.C.? Washington, D.C. will be completely cut off if Maryland leaves. Okay. Baltimore is a major transportation hub. I'm not talking about BWI, I'm talking about the railroad yards in Washington. And if Maryland leaves, then that transportation hub is gone as well. Okay, there's a story about Abraham Lincoln coming to Washington D.C. for his inauguration. Abraham Lincoln obviously has to come through Maryland, and when he gets to Baltimore by train, to get from the north down to D.C., you actually had to get off a train in Baltimore, travel a couple of city blocks to another train station, and then ride into Washington, D.C. Well, when Washington was coming to D.C., there were pretty credible reports that there was a plan to assassinate him. So he actually had to sneak into Washington, D.C. to be inaugurated. Now, that doesn't seem like the greatest way to make an entrance, does it? And Lincoln, I think, in the end, is kind of ashamed that he snuck in. But who knows? Maybe it was the right thing to have done. So that kind of highlights how important Maryland could be. We're going to get back to Maryland on our next slide. Here's something that's a little bit harder to explain. I said in the last lecture that Lincoln purportedly said, "I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky." Well, what does he mean by that? Well, let's look at the map. If you look at this map here, you see the Ohio River. Now, how long have we been talking about the Ohio River in this class? Yeah, I think it was basically from about day 5. We've been talking about the Ohio River. So let's think about this. The Ohio River is really important. Let's just look at it on the map. If you control Kentucky, and obviously you control Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, if you control Kentucky, you control the Ohio River. And where does the Ohio River lead? It leads right to the Mississippi. Okay? Think about how many times this year we've talked about there not being good roads going out west. If there are no roads, what do you use for transportation? You use a river. Okay? The Ohio River is navigable, as is the Mississippi. And the Union Army wants to use this river to drive itself into the south, down the Mississippi River. You can also go down the, I think it's the Cumberland and the Tennessee rivers. And those go all the way into the south. And without Kentucky, that means, you've got just that much more area to invade and conquer. But if you have Kentucky, you have free reign on this river. So that's really important from a military strategic point of view. Okay, there's another reason, and it's even more complicated. It has to do with what we call the butternut region. Now, I'm quite sure that none of you have ever heard of the butternut region. Maybe a few of you. Maybe if you're from the butternut region, or you have, Auntie Mabel is from the butternut region, but probably you don't. The butternut region, maybe some of you could guess, is essentially southern Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. Think about this. When the Ohio Company of Virginia was trying to claim the Ohio River Valley, they wanted to send settlers to live there. Where would these settlers be from? That's right, they'd be from Virginia. What would they bring with them? Well, if they're settling on the southern side of the river, they're going to bring their slaves, right? Because Virginia is a slave-holding state. Now, some of those people are going to settle on the northern side of that river. Can they bring slaves? No. Remember, the Northwest Ordinance said what about all of these states? Said that they could not have slaves. However, if you're from Virginia, do you bring your culture with you? Yeah, you don't bring your slaves, but you still think that slavery is an okay thing? You probably do. So here's the point. The butternut region, how will they feel about the South and about slavery? Will they be on the side of the South or not? The answer is they're going to be sympathetic to the South. I'm just trying to find a pointer. There we go, pointer options. Very nice. Okay, so the people living in this area, the butternuts, they are going to be sympathetic to the South. Now, what do they do for a living? They farm, right? And if you're a farmer, you're no longer just farming for yourself, you're farming to produce a surplus of products so that you can sell them on a market. But how do you get your goods to market? Well, the easiest way is to get them on the Ohio River and down the Mississippi River. Okay, but if you're at war with the South and the South controls the Mississippi River, can you get your goods to market? Not easily. Okay, so Lincoln is afraid that if he doesn't open up the Mississippi River soon, what will the people in this region who are already sympathetic with the South, what will they do? He's afraid they're going to rebel and they're going to cause these three really big, important states to drop out of the war effort. So for Lincoln, keeping Kentucky is important because it'll make it that much easier to gain the Mississippi River. And if you gain the Mississippi River, you no longer have to worry about these three states leaving the war effort. That's a little bit complicated. Generally speaking, kids don't understand that on the first time around. So please feel free to ask me questions on Wednesday. Okay, so that's those are the things having to do with the butternut region. Okay, now when you use a pointer, apparently you cannot advance your screen. So that is really not ideal. Let's see, there we go. Okay, got to use another thing. All right, so here's the next topic. I hate PowerPoint so much. Don't write that down, that's not on the test, but anyway, so the next topic is this. Lincoln is going to expand the executive power, and he's going to curb civil liberties in the process. So these are things that, you know, our society still deals with today. If you recall, we had an impeachment not too long ago. And what is an impeachment about? It's about Congress trying to limit the president's powers, or it's about the president claiming more power than the Constitution gives him and Congress trying to prevent him from doing that. Obviously, Congress was unsuccessful with President Trump. Congress didn't even try, really, to limit the power of the president, President Lincoln, during the Civil War. And I'll try to explain why. So the first thing he does is this. After the Battle of Fort Sumter, I think I already told you that he increased the size of the army by 75,000 men. He called for 75,000 volunteers for 90 days. He did that without congressional approval. Do you remember when we read the enumerated powers earlier this year? It's fun stuff, wasn't it? We went around the table. We all got our own little paragraph to read. What paragraph did you read? Do you remember? Well, one of you, I know, read a paragraph that said this. Congress will create an army and a navy. Not the president, but Congress. It's Congress's job. However, Lincoln needed an army and he needed it fast, so he just called for 90 or 75,000 volunteers. Unconstitutional, but he did it. Okay. Now, Congress could have said, like, hey, you can't do that. We're going to have an army of 70,000 men instead. But they didn't. They just went with it. Next, he spends I was going to say appropriate, but he did not appropriate, but he spent $2 million without congressional appropriation. Now, you remember that word. Appropriation is when Congress says, here's some money, and this money will be spent for this thing, not that thing. Lincoln says, well, I'm going to take that money and I'm going to spend it on what I need to spend it on, right? And I need to do that quickly. So he does that without congressional appropriation. Again, could Congress cry foul? They could, and they probably did, but they didn't do anything about it, so he gets away with it. Next, he orders a blockade of the South. Now, a blockade is an act of war. Has Congress declared war? It hasn't, but he goes ahead and makes a warlike act anyway. The biggest and most important one, the one that people generally remember, has to do with our civil liberties. Okay, as I mentioned just a few moments ago, Maryland was a slaveholding state which had sympathies for the South, and it's also in a place that could really, really, really hurt the Union war effort. Lincoln had to sneak through Baltimore to get to Washington, D.C. for his inauguration. That tells you of how troublesome you Marylanders could be. All of the troops that are going to go fight outside of Washington, D.C. and into Virginia, they have to come through Maryland on the railroad network. Lincoln is afraid that pro-Southern Marylanders might try to blow up railroad bridges. There was a riot in Baltimore. I think it was a regiment from Massachusetts had to get off just like Lincoln did. They had to get off one train, march across town, and get on another train. And as they did that, pro-slavery protesters started attacking them. That's kind of dangerous, right? So Lincoln's really worried about Marylander. And here's what he does. He suspends the writ of habeas corpus in Maryland. Now, you all should remember what the writ of habeas corpus is. Habeas corpus is that right that we all have. We're all happy to have this right. It's a right to not be arrested without the government charging us with a crime. Just think about this. If the government charges you with a crime, you can then defend yourself against that crime and say, I didn't do it. It wasn't me. It was that guy. If they don't charge you with a crime, then you're just locked up and there's nothing you can do about it, right? So, if I get hauled away by the police, they have to arrest me. I mean, if they arrest me, they have to charge me. And I think they have, I don't know, it's been a long time since I've been arrested, but I think it's 48 hours, maybe 24 hours. Lincoln says, nope, in Maryland, we're just going to arrest people. No charges at all. We'll just arrest them. There are people that are suspicious. And even though we don't have any evidence against them, we're just going to lock them up because if we don't, they might blow up a railroad bridge and that might make us lose the war. So in essence, I am going to put a little bit of tear in the Constitution in order to save the Constitution. Does that make sense? Okay, now, can you do this? Well, he did it. And in fact, the Constitution allows for it, right? So read this. The privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless, when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. So you see, the Constitution actually allows this, right? The founders were smart. They knew that there might be a time when you have to just arrest people without charging them, right? And when can you do that? Well, in cases of rebellion or invasion. Which do we have? We have a rebellion. It's a rebellion that's going on here, right? So no problem, right? No problem at all, except read the citation. Where is this clause in the Constitution? It's called the suspension clause, I believe. Not the Santa Claus. There is no sanity clause in the Constitution. It's the suspension clause, and it's in Article 1, Section 9. Well, what is Article 1 all about? Is it about the executive branch? If anyone answered yes, I'm going to come to your house and I'm going to fix you, right? Of course, Article 1 is not about the executive branch. It's about the Congress, right? It's about the legislative branch. So I put it to you, if Article 1, which gives us essentially the size, shape, and powers of Congress, says that the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus can be suspended in certain cases. Who gets to do the suspending? Probably Congress, right? Not the president. But who did the suspending? The president. Constitutional? Doesn't look like it. I don't think it's constitutional. I'm no lawyer, but I don't think it's constitutional. However, the president can do whatever the president wants to do if Congress lets him. And guess what Congress does? They don't do anything. They let him get away with this. Here's the logic. President Lincoln, I'm sure, is thinking, well, if I don't do this and I lose the war, who's everyone going to blame? Congress? No, they're going to blame me. So I'm going to go ahead and do this. And if Congress doesn't like it, they can fight me. And if they want to impeach me, they can impeach me. But if the public is for what I'm doing, I'll probably be safe. Okay. Now, we're going to see that happen again and again in American history. After 9/11, did President George W. Bush do some things that some people thought were violations of our civil liberties? Yeah. And you know what he said? He said, guess who's going to get blamed if there's another attack? It's going to be me. So I'm willing to run this risk. And if Congress really thinks that what I'm doing is wrong, then Congress can take me to court. Congress can impeach me. But Congress better watch out, because if we get attacked again, people might blame them. Okay, so that's the basic logic. Now, I think we look back on Abraham Lincoln, we say he did the right thing. I think we probably say the same thing about George W. Bush, but we shouldn't always be so careful, or we shouldn't always be so sure of ourselves, right? Someday history might judge us differently. All right, now on to some battles. Okay, how do we get to the next slide? There we go. So as I think I said already, there are thousands of Civil War battles, and we could not cover all of them. We can't even cover most of them. We're going to cover just a couple of them. And today I'm only going to cover 3. Later on, I'll cover the rest. But I want to talk about battles that have real political significance, and probably all battles do, but these ones have the most significance. Okay, so the first battle I want to talk about is the First Battle of Bull Run. Yes, there are 2. In fact, not only are there 2 battles of Bull Run, but the Battle of Bull Run has 2 names. The Union tends to name its battles after the closest river, or in this case, stream or run. Bull Run is a stream. A run is a stream. The Confederacy calls it the First Battle of Manassas. They name their battles after the nearest town. Okay, so just something you might want to know. Here's a nifty little painting of the First Battle of Bull Run. It's one of the first kind of big engagements of the war. Here's the deal. There's a lot of pressure on Lincoln to finish this war, to go out and fight this war and win it. And everyone thinks that if you just go and capture Richmond, which is only 90 miles away, and it's the Confederacy's capital, if you capture Richmond, the war will be over. So Lincoln has this brand new army of 75,000 volunteers. The problem is they are green. Okay, now what does that mean? Being green is the opposite of being seasoned. Okay, and I think the metaphor here is of wood. Think about if you cut down a tree. Any of you cut down any trees lately? I mean, you've got a lot of time on your hands. You should go outside and cut down a tree. If you cut down a tree, the wood is green because it's got a lot of water in it. So what do? You stack the wood and you let it season. That is, spend a season outdoors, in which case the wood will dry. I think that's the metaphor. So these troops are green, meaning they're rookies, they're inexperienced, they're not well trained. But Lincoln sends them off into battle anyway. They're just 30 miles from Washington, D.C. at Bull Run, and they come across a Confederate army. The Union Army is heading on down to Richmond, and they come across a Confederate army. It's close to D.C., so what happens is you get what we'll call Washington Society decides to come out and watch. Now, what do I mean by society? Society is like the muckety-mucks, the wealthy people of Washington. They decide to go out and have a picnic lunch and watch a battle. I mean, you would do that right about now, wouldn't you? I mean, things are kind of boring around here. So they go out to watch. Remember, in literature, you're in the Romantic era. And is this romantic to watch young men stride off into battle and maybe die gloriously for their country? Yeah, man, that sounds like a lot of fun. So there are spectators for this battle. And it turns out really, really poorly for the Union. The 30 miles from DC, there's a picnic lunch going on. Union is looking for a quick and easy victory. They run into Stonewall Jackson and they are routed by him. Okay, don't make me explain what routed means again. Okay, you should know this by now. I think this is the battle where Stonewall Jackson got the nickname Stonewall. It's a pretty good nickname. And the Union just, the lines of Union soldiers break and run almost from the first shots. And it's made more complicated because there's all these picnickers around. And so, soldiers are like getting their feet caught in picnic baskets, and there are ham sandwiches everywhere, and, spilled lemonade. It turns into the first Baltimore or Washington Beltway traffic jam. All of that is not true. Maybe some of it's true. Let's hope some of it's true. But it's just a disaster for the Union. And maybe ironically, it actually, in the end, probably helps the Union out, because what does the Union realize it has to do now? It has to buckle down and fight a serious war, right? It has to gird itself for a long war. Lincoln is going to turn to a general named George McClellan, who actually has a pretty good reputation for being someone who knows how to train an army. He really likes to drill. That is, he likes to practice. The problem is he's going to turn out he doesn't really like to go into battle very often. And that's going to be a real handicap, as you can imagine. On the other hand, the South becomes overconfident. Southerners believe that Northerners can't fight, that they're a bunch of shopkeepers and clodhoppers, and that they just aren't really as manly as Southerners. Southerners kind of have more of a martial tradition. It's a little bit more rural, so people kind of grow up with firearms and having to kind of ride horses more often. I mean, I think those things are true in the North as well, but the South thinks that they do it better. Anyway, so that's the first Battle of Bull Run. It's a big Union loss, but it kind of wakes the Union up, and that's in July of 1861. Next big battle is called the Peninsula Campaign, and then associated with the Peninsula Campaign is the 7 Days Battle. Okay, so the Peninsula Campaign, this is George McClellan's campaign to run. As I mentioned in my last slide, McClellan likes to train, likes to drill, but he's super cautious. He never wants to go into battle. He always thinks that he's not ready. And Lincoln, remember, he's the president, and there's a lot of pressure on him to end this war quickly. So Lincoln's getting frustrated. He accuses McClellan of having what he calls the slows. Folksy, yeah? You got the slows. Some of you have the slows. Sometimes I have the slows. It just happens. Anyway, so McClellan is finally persuaded to attack Richmond. Remember, Richmond is the capital, and if you take Richmond, the war could be over. Richmond's only 90 miles away from Washington, D.C., so that doesn't seem like too hard of a thing to do, but McClellan takes kind of an odd route. Instead of marching 90 miles, which I'm guessing an army could do in a week, probably less than a week, 20 miles a day, do the math. He decides to put his whole army on troop transports, sail down the Potomac River, down the Chesapeake Bay, and land them here on this peninsula. That's why we call it the Peninsula Campaign, right? So remember, a peninsula, body of land surrounded on three sides by water. This don't look like Florida, but it's peninsula all the same. And note, there's some historical echoes here. The James River, this is where Jamestown was founded, okay? Yorktown is right here. The Battle of Yorktown ended the Revolutionary War. I think of the Revolutionary War when old General Howe decided to take his army down to Philadelphia by ship, and how much time he wasted doing that, McClellan's going to waste a lot of time putting his army on ship and sailing it down. He lands them here on the tip of the peninsula, and then it takes him a full month to march his way up. Okay. Now, on the one hand, you might say, like, well, if the Confederacy is expecting an invasion from this side, maybe McClellan will take him by surprise, but not if it takes a month. In fact, McClellan gets stuck in front of Yorktown for over a week because Yorktown is heavily defended by imitation cannons made of logs. But he's so cautious that he dare not attack. And finally, when he takes Yorktown, he realizes that he's been duped. Anyway, he finally works his way up to the outskirts of Richmond. And guess what happens? General Robert E. Lee launches a counterattack. Okay, so here's Robert E. Lee on the right. Here's McClellan on the left. Note McClellan's got his hand in his jacket because he thinks he's Napoleon, right? But the real Napoleon here is actually Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee is a battlefield genius. McClellan, not so much. So the Union Army finally gets to Richmond, and Lee launches a counterattack. And in 7 days, this is the 7 days battle, Lee manages to push McClellan all the way back to the sea. So think about how much time he took getting there and how quickly he gets pushed back. Now, here's the real significance of this battle. This is huge. Pay attention, write this down. You got to know this. The Union suffers 10,000 casualties. That's dead and wounded. It's a big number, right? That's in 7 days. That's a very large number. I would have to look it up, but certainly we haven't even come close to that many dead in Afghanistan after 20 years of fighting. Okay, now that's a very different kind of war, but still 10,000, big number. Confederates, 20,000 dead and wounded. Who wins the battle? Well, who gains their objective? Not the Union. So the Union loses this battle, but the victory for the South comes at quite a cost. It's a Pyrrhic victory, yes? But even more importantly, Abraham Lincoln, when he looks at these numbers, he says, "Oi, this is not," well, I don't think he said "oi." Maybe he said "oi," but probably not. He looks at these numbers and he says, "Oh, this can no longer be a war just to preserve the Union. Too many people are dead and wounded. If I only make this a war to preserve the Union, and I don't get rid of the underlying cause that has led to this war, will there be another disunion? Will the Union break apart again?" And the answer is yes. Why did the Union break apart? What's the issue that's causing it to break apart? Well, of course, the issue is slavery. So if I don't want these 30,000 to have died or been wounded in vain, I have to fight this war not just to preserve the Union, but to free the slaves, because slavery is what's causing this war. It's a very important point there. Lincoln, because of the 7 days battle, decides this is now a war to end slavery. Okay? He does this privately. He doesn't make this public. Now, here's the question. Why does he not publicly say this is now a war to end slavery? Think about it. If he says he's going to free the slaves, what will the border states do? They all hold slaves. Will they leave the Union? Probably. And if they leave the Union, what happens to the war? Well, the Union loses. Okay, so Lincoln realizes I got to free the slaves, but I can't announce this until I have the border states firmly in hand. Okay, so if you don't understand what I'm saying, make a note of this and ask me on Wednesday. Okay, so that is Lincoln's plan. He comes up with the idea of the Emancipation Proclamation, but he doesn't announce it. Okay. This brings us to the next big battle, and it's the Battle of Antietam. I'm actually going to go back to the last slide because I don't want you writing, well, I won't do that. I'll just stay here. But Robert E. Lee decides he is going to attack and fight in Maryland. Okay, and Antietam Creek, or it's also known as Sharpsburg. Robert E. Lee decides he's going to fight up in Maryland. Okay, here's why. If he fights in Maryland, he is going to threaten Washington, D.C., right? And again, if you take Washington, D.C., the war is probably over. Okay, this is going to put a lot of political pressure on Lincoln. He also thinks that Maryland, which is a border state with slaves and is sympathetic to Lee, he thinks that if his army goes into Maryland, Marylanders will flock to his colors. Now, what do I mean by flock to his colors? Well, if you look at this picture here, this is a recreation of the Battle of Antietam. I don't know when it was taken, but it's a recreation. You see how there are flags in various parts of the field? Those are the colors. And back then, when you're in an army in a battle and it's confusing and you don't know where you're supposed to be, you look for your colors and you go to them. So Robert E. Lee thinks Marylanders are going to basically join his army. Now remember, well, I haven't told you this yet, but Robert E. Lee's army is very successful. It's been winning battle after battle before September of 1862. Don't we all want to be on winning teams? I think so. I think we like to get chosen to be on winning teams. However, we also like our winning teams to have nice uniforms, don't we? And here's the problem. When Robert E. Lee comes into Maryland, Marylanders who are sympathetic, they look at his army and they say, I'm not joining that army. Those guys don't even have boots. They don't even have hats on. Those guys they look like scarecrows. They're skinny. Because even though Robert E. Lee is winning, his army is not very well supplied. And this goes to show you of the weakness of the South's manufacturing and transportation base. They can barely feed their army, okay? A lot of their soldiers didn't have boots. I don't think you'd want to be walking around going into battle without boots on. And they don't have hats. Now you're wondering, like, who cares about hats? Well, if you spent every day of the summer outside in Virginia, you would want a hat to keep the sun off. And if an army can't even provide hats for his soldiers, that army is hurting, okay? So Marylanders do not flock to the colors, okay? Anyway, next point. Lee also thinks that if he wins a battle in Maryland, Britain and France will have an excuse to mediate an end to this war. Remember what I said the other day. Britain and France would both like to see the United States break up. Why? What does that do? Well, it hurts America's absolute strength, which strengthens Britain and France in relative terms. So they would love to see this turn into two countries. And they're just looking for a reason to mediate. And if Robert E. Lee wins in a northern state, then they could do that. Here are the results. As I already mentioned, Marylanders do not join his army. In fact, the Union has found a copy of Lee's battle plans. Some officer who had a copy of the plans dropped them carelessly on the battlefield before the battle started. He had a couple of cigars wrapped up in the plans. So some Union soldiers saw some cigars on the ground and they snagged them and then realized that they had the great general's battle plans, and they gave them to their commanding general, who now knows exactly what Robert E. Lee is up to. So if you can't win this battle, then you're hurting. And in fact, he doesn't win this battle. This battle is a tie. It's considered a draw between the two. They fight to a standstill. Robert E. Lee, though, is able to escape across the Potomac River. This is very frustrating to Lincoln. Lincoln's going to fire McClellan because of this. But at the same time, when you're losing battle after battle, a tie seems pretty good, right? So even though it's only a tie, Lincoln is going to consider this a win. It's a very bloody win. This is the bloodiest day in all of American history. Okay, 22,000 casualties. That's both sides, but remember, both sides are Americans. And we've never had a bloodier day. Pearl Harbor, only about 3,000 died at Pearl Harbor. D-Day, I think the casualty rate's more like 6,000. 9/11 is about 3,000. 22,000. It's a lot. And Lincoln says, okay, this is enough of a victory that I can now announce the Emancipation Proclamation. Think about it. Why didn't he announce it before? Because if he announced that he was going to free the slaves, what would the border states do? The border states would leave and he'd lose the war. What has the Battle of Antietam just proven about the border states, about Maryland? That they don't want to leave. So he's got them. So he announces the Emancipation Proclamation, and he says that's going to be put into effect January 1st, 1863. The emancipation is going to put even more pressure on Britain and France not to intervene. Because remember, after the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, how do the people of Britain and France feel about the Civil War? They're pro-North because they want to get rid of slavery. And now that Lincoln is promising to get rid of slavery, that makes them even more pro-North. Okay, now, what does the Emancipation Proclamation actually do? Again, it's not going to be go into effect until January 1st, but the Emancipation Proclamation frees all slaves that are in Southern held territory. So does it do anything? Can Lincoln actually free slaves in territory he doesn't control? No. I mean, do you think Southerners are going to be like, well, you heard it, boys. I guess you're free. No, of course not. However, the Emancipation Proclamation, which doesn't free any slaves in the border states, not yet, but it's going to, news of it's going to spread into the South, and slaves are going to find out about it, and slaves are going to start freeing themselves. Okay, and we're going to have, I think, 600,000 slaves who free themselves. The Emancipation Proclamation also says that the U.S. Army will accept Black people into its ranks. And you're going to have, I think it's 150,000 African Americans fight in the Union Army. And that number is really going to be important. That number is going to help the Union win this war. So if you ever want to ask, did Black people fight in the Civil War and did they help win the war? The answer is absolutely yes. Even the act of freeing yourself as a slave is helping to win the war, because if you're not working in the South, you're hurting the South's capacity to produce, and that's going to hurt the war effort. And remember, this is a risky proposition to try to free yourself. If you get caught, you're going to be killed or maybe sent back into slavery, but it's going to be really harsh. So there's a lot of courage that goes into freeing oneself. And then to join the ranks of the Union Army to fight in the South is also going to be a pretty courageous thing. What do you think the South is going to do to capture Black soldiers? Yeah, they're going to get killed. So this is a huge thing. If on the in the fall field trip, if you went to Lincoln Park with me and you saw that statue of Lincoln freeing the slave, and I remember I said, like, yeah, it didn't really work the way the statue portrays it, because it looked like Lincoln's doing the freeing. In fact, slaves freed themselves. Okay, but the Emancipation Proclamation was a really important encouragement to that kind of thing. Okay, so that's the Emancipation Proclamation, and that is the Battle of Antietam Creek. Now, the very last thing I want to talk about today is this. When Lincoln decides to free the slaves, he realizes that he's going to have to fight this war differently. He's going to fight what I call a total war, okay? And total war is a phrase that basically conveys the sense that this is not a war where it's just soldier fighting soldier. This is society fighting society. Lincoln realizes that to get rid of slavery, he can't just free the slaves. He has to destroy the very structure of Southern society that allowed slavery to begin with. Remember early on this year when we read that essay, Drawing the Color Line, and we talked about how the Virginia planters created racism by making laws that treated Black people differently than white indentured servants. That's gone on for 200 years. The South has been basically making a society in which slavery and racism were important. Lincoln decides he's got to destroy that society so that it can be rebuilt in a different image. And so here are I think there's 6 points of his total war, otherwise known as the Anaconda Plan. What is an anaconda? It is a big snake that constricts, squeezes its prey to death. Okay, here's the first thing. Well, there it is. First thing is he's going to try to blockade the South. It's going to be a leaky blockade at first, but eventually the Union Navy will be able to blockade the South. What does that mean? Prevent all things from getting to the South. That would include weapons, but it also includes food. Also prevent all things from leaving the South, especially cotton. Great Britain really needs American cotton because it's a textile manufacturing country, and it needs cotton. And if the South can't give it cotton, then that's going to be bad for the South. Might be bad for Great Britain. Turns out Great Britain's going to turn to India and Egypt, 2 of its colonies, for that cotton. Another reason why Britain doesn't join the South side. If you're blockading the South so they can't sell anything or buy anything, that's going to help starve the South out. Now, does that only hurt soldiers? It does hurt soldiers, but it also hurts civilians. Does Lincoln know that? He does. He's trying to destroy the South's ability to wage war, and to do that, he's waging war on civilians. He's going to liberate the slaves. We've already talked about that. If the slaves all get up and run away, then the South can't produce as much. It also has to reserve some of its soldiers to protect from runaway slaves. Okay, so that will really hurt the Southern effort. He wants to seize the Mississippi River and cut the South in half. I talked about how opening up the Mississippi River to trade from the butternut region is really important, but it also will hurt the South's ability to trade as well. He's going to invade and lay waste to the heartland. Georgia and the Carolinas, these are like the places that produce a lot of crops for the South. Later on, I'll talk about a Union general named William Tecumseh Sherman. Who was it? Someone's middle name was Tecumseh. Is that Dylan? Was that your brother? I forget. Anyway, William Tecumseh Sherman, he's famous for just burning his way through the South. He just burns a wide swath through the South. Again, the idea is to destroy the Southern economy and destroy the Southern way of life. If you burn every plantation house you see, who are you really hurting? You're hurting the planter aristocracy. And if you destroy their wealth, maybe you can destroy their political power, and maybe that will help you destroy slavery. Okay, so that's the idea. He wants to capture the capital of Richmond, and then he's going to fight a war of attrition, which just means this. Every battle you get into, try to kill as many of the enemy as possible. We have more men than they do, so that is the North does. So if you keep killing, eventually they won't be able to fight any longer, and also destroy their economy. Okay, so that's it for today, folks. I hope that worked out. Let me know if you like the PowerPoint or if you want me to go back to the notebook. It's up to you. Okay, so we'll talk about all this on Wednesday. I'll give you some reading to do for this, and I'll give you a quiz on this and the reading, which will be due on Friday. Okay, have a wondrous evening. Peace out.